Yo, what up everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka it's week 2 of my power ranking. So I've got a bunch of decks that y'all suggested. I've got them rated, ranked, and ready to go. So let me drop this video for you so that way maybe you have maybe a little bit of an idea of what you might be able to play this weekend and get some dubs. Let's get to it. Alright, so I switched up the format and I will go over this as we go, but let's just get straight to it. Let's not make this video longer than we know it's probably going to be because there's just so many decks to go over. And again, remember you can always use the timeline, to skip to what you want to listen to, the chapters, but let's get to it. So the first deck that I have on the menu is going to be Pikachu EX with Raichu, Magneton, and Lieutenant Surge, aka Major Bob. Now when you take a look at this deck, I rated it 5 out of 5 for early game, and I started adding things that you guys suggested in the criteria, so I'm going to go over them really quickly as well. So early game is going to be the how much are the attacks costing, what's the damage that they're doing, what's the pressure that this deck is applying. And in my opinion, again, Pikachu variants tend to have the best early game out of most decks in the entire game, if not the best, like probably the best right now. In terms of mid game, it's going to be retreat / pivot. So like how much is your retreat? Can you pivot like out of the active spot very easily? And then again, how much damage are you doing? What's the scaling of your attack? Is it actually scaling as the game goes longer? And then as well as your HP, is your HP scaling as the game goes longer? So are you evolving, or are you just kind of evolving one time and staying the same? No heal? Like what's going on there? But I do have heal and health as well, so keep that in mind. All right, so power is going to be like, what's your damage cap? What's the speed of how fast you start attacking? And then like how consistent is that attack, right? Is it like a same thing every time? Is it a coin flip? That's going to be one of those things that we're looking at too. And then health is going to have the total HP of like all of your Pokemon, pretty much, the healing factor that you may or may not have, and then can you like soak damage like Pikachu decks do, and then kind of retreat, pivot out of the active spot. And then again, consistency is just kind of, is the deck evolving? Is there going to be searching / drawing? What about the coin flips? Is there a lot of coin flips, whether it's the trainers or the attacks? What's going on there? And then overall, you've got all that added up and then divided. So again, I tried to put a little brief discussion for each deck and all these. And again, mid to late game, I thought that it can suffer if Pikachu EX is not in the active. You may be doing less damage or like very little damage. But the power of this variant is going to be that you're going to have the flexibility to deal that 140 in the end, towards the middle or the late game. So very big advantage there. Stage 1s tend to have a bulk issue there. Like the Raichu is pretty glassy. The Magneton is definitely glassy. Then when you talk about consistency, you're running more evolutions, and then you got that pseudo stage 2, because like you have Pikachu, Raichu, and then the stage 2 is sort of Lieutenant Surge, except you can play it the same turn that you evolve the Raichu. So I've gone over that many times, but just to kind of make sure everybody is on the same page. All right. And by the way, you saw the rating at the bottom, I believe. The rating at the bottom was a 4 out of 5. I believe it scored a 20.5. So, there's a little bit of a fraction there. But anyway, so let's get to the second variant that I'm covering. And by the way, you'll notice that I'm having deck lists for all these. So 5 out of 5 for the early game, pretty simple there. I said that, mid to late game, this is definitely a decent mid game, but it can be lacking in the late game. It's not going to hit for that 140. It's going to need coin flips. In terms of power, you're gonna notice that this is gonna deal 70 damage with Electrode, right? So that's kind of like, can be good if you're sending out the Electrode, but again, it can struggle with the bulk that Electrode and Pincurchin has, right? Very low HP. It's going to get one shot in the mirror very easily a lot of the time. So it can be a little glassy, right? That's one of the issues. And then you start looking at decks that like a Pidgeot, like a Arbok, you know, maybe they have a coughing, a wheezing, right? They're chipping. So, you know, it can be a little bit of an issue. Very consistent at putting early damage and mid-game pressure. You know, again, once it gets to that late game, that's when Pikachu decks get a little bit sketchy. And again, less brick hands than almost every other deck in the game, right? But this is definitely a variant of Pikachu that can use Electrode to kind of soften your opponents, right? You kind of hit them for 70 and then you can switch into that Pikachu. So again, all these Pikachu variants are going to be 4 out of 5, and they all have, like, you know, different advantages. Like this one is going to have the ZebSNIPER, right, which means that it's going to have flexibility to deal damage to the bench. So it can bring opposing Pikachus down from 120 to 90, which is huge, but it can also finish things off. Okay, so again, just decent mid game. You know, pretty simple here. It's got double Zapdos EX, so that way, you know, you kind of have an idea also that it's pretty bulky. Especially when you start comparing it to like the variant that had Magneton and Raichu, right? Then you know, in this particular version, you know, in terms of health, you've also got potions. So, you know, the trainers can be mixed and matched. I think 2 of the 3 Pikachu lists are playing potions, so, you know, take that for what you will. But this is just some different ideas that, you know, you can potentially use to play Pikachu decks, because I know people wanted to see deck list. But again, this is a variant using ZebSNIPER. All right, going on to 5 basic Mewtwo and Gardevoir, and this is going to be featuring Jynx. Okay, so early game you're going to prefer Mewtwo or Jynx in the active, like over Ralts obviously, but even then, like, you know, Mewtwo is decent. Jynx is pretty rough when you open with it. It's pretty rough, right? You probably don't want to open Jynx a lot of the time. Then when you get to the mid to late game, again, 150 is just devastating. You know, in terms of, it's got high damage, but it's also often going to require Gardevoir, right? Like if you don't have the Gardevoir going, you're probably not dealing 150 like every turn. You need that Gardevoir to come online, so that way that 150 can be consistent. The Mewtwo bulk is very good, and then a lot of the time you do have room for potion, so that kind of can extend the life of your Mewtwo. And then again, Jynx is kind of a little bit of a weak spot in some matchups, but Jynx really shines, in my opinion, in the Charizard matchup and the mirror with Mewtwo matchup, right? Like if you're mirror matching. But this is a deck that avoids coin flips just straight up, and the deck is pretty consistent. You know, it does pretty much the same thing almost every game. Now, you may not evolve Gardevoir every game, but it's going to do a very similar, you know, play style or play pattern like every game pretty much, you know. So keep that in mind. But again, this is just going to be the Mewtwo variant that uses Jynx, you know, basically for the mirror and for Charizard. So, and again, like that, I gave it 3.6. I think both the variants scored about the same score. But, you know, maybe, again, just because a score is lower than maybe a Pikachu doesn't mean it can't beat Pikachu. Okay, it just may have deficiencies in other areas. So this is the base Mewtwo version. Again, you can see the double potion there. The big change is going to be the base Mewtwo over the Jynx, right? So it's, instead of dealing 150, you know, in the mid to late game, it can do 120 to 150, which is huge because if you've got the Mewtwo in that's not EX, it can provide pretty good bulk, and then you could potentially, you know, make your opponent trade, you know, their 2 prizer for your 1 prizer, right? So very good there, very good option, especially against decks like Pikachu, right? So again, just often requires Gardevoir, and we talked about the bulk, and again, it pretty much avoids coin flips like altogether outside of like the who goes first coin flip. So, you know, keep that in mind. If I was playing in a tournament this weekend, you know, this would definitely be one of the decks that I would have to try to decide, like either this one or the Raichu variant, and I probably lean towards the Raichu variant, just to be real honest. So let's get to Charizard EX and a lot of everybody's favorites, fossils. You know, again, I just try to think, you know, what's a deck list that did well recently, and then, you know, does the idea look like it actually works? Because I've played fossils, I've played Kangaskhan, and I gotta say, like, you probably want Moltres in the active like more times than not, right? Just so you can get that ramp going. And, you know, the fossils do a pretty good job of protecting your Charmander or Charmeleon. So if you can get that rolling, great. Again, it's just going to depend on, you know, hopefully you got Moltres. You know, that's just going to what it comes down to. And speaking of that, the early game, it's extremely reliant on Moltres opener and obviously coin flips. And then, you know, it's going to rarely do damage. A lot of the time, it's just going to be ramping or trying to ramp. And then maybe you're lucky if you get to attack for 70 and start knocking some basics out. Again, it's powerful if it's able to evolve, It's got the, you know, the highest damage output to a single Pokemon in the game. That's like not a coin flip, right? So yeah, that's a very big advantage. And then it's very bulky. When you take a look at like the EX Pokemon in this deck, it's very bulky. And then obviously the fossils do help with being able to, like, hey, you can just discard them. Just remember to discard the fossils. Don't leave them sitting on your bench after you've already moved, you know, Charizard to the active, right? Like, discard it so that way they can't Sabrina and knock it out, right? But again, it's a stage 2 deck built to one-hit KO, you know, pretty much any threat in the entire game. So if you can get to it, you know, you got a great chance at winning. All right, so and by the way, you know, you can see the ratings too, and I'll have the ratings at the end as well. Charizard with the 3.5, so again, slightly higher than the deck that we're looking at right here. This is going to be Articuno EX and Starmie EX, which again, it's got potentially just devastating early game, right, with Misty or an on-curve Starmie EX, like immediately dealing 90. And then again, you know, one of the new things in this new rating format that I added was the ability to pivot. And, you know, that's one thing that Starmie EX really excels at, right? So again, damage capped at about 80 to 90, unless you know, count Giovanni and so on, or weakness. But, you know, it can be very efficient. So, you know, hey, the fact that it can be done early, it's a little bit of a trade-off there. It just peaks really early. But above average bulk, in my opinion, when you look at these Pokemon, they're pretty thick. And again, you know, one of the big issues with consistency is just going to be like, sometimes you're going to need to draw that Starmie EX like turn 2 immediately. You know, sometimes you're going to need the heads on Misty or you just lose. And that's just kind of the nature of some of these kinds of decks. Again, you know, 3.2 out of 5, you know, 16 points. That's not a bad deck. It's not a bad deck at all. I think Ursi won a tournament with it. Then this is actually a deck that I know some people that, you know, I talk to pretty much every day in Pokemon Pocket now. I think they actually piloted and helped create this deck. But Greninja and Starmie, so this is kind of showing you a little bit of a different variant, I guess, than some people might be used to. But it's using Kangaskhan and Farfetch to potentially deal early damage. And again, the fact that it plays multiple basics allows it to start getting in earlier, and then, you know, hopefully evolving that Greninja, evolving that Starmie on the bench while, you know, your 1 energy attackers are getting in early. Again, no EX Pokemon outside of the Starmie EX, so, you know, hey, that can make the game go longer as well. It is damage capped, you know, at about 90 to 110. So that's kind of an issue, but, you know, again, if you're pinging all game, you should still be okay. You should still be okay. Outside of that, you know, decent bulk, nothing to write home about. It's definitely not thicker than, you know, a Moltres deck or anything like that with Charizard, right? But you can definitely see that it's got more HP than, you know, or about the same HP as, you know, what you would see in just about a Pikachu deck, right? So again, relying on evolving, it can be a little bit cloggy with like all the different basics that you have in the deck along with the double Pokeball, so you may not hit what you want off the Pokeball. So a lot of people would say play Professor Research first and then Pokeball, so that way, you know, you kind of thin your deck out of basics, hopefully, and then get the basic you need off of Pokeball worst case. All right, so 3.2, I do think it's a very solid deck. All right, moving on. So this is one that was in all my comments, right? Marowak EX and Primeape. So a lot of people wanted me to talk about this deck, so let's talk about this deck. So first of all, you can see the list on the right as I start talking about some of the points that I wanted to bring up. Again, you know, you can start dealing 80 to 160 damage, you know, very early on in the game, right? Obviously a little coin flip dependent, or hopefully your Primeape is online and you're dealing for that, you know, that 100. But again, it does tend to over rely on Marowak EX in the like mid to late game, because like sometimes Primeape is just going to be dead. It's just going to be a dead card, or you can't really do anything with it, and you just rather put the energy on Marowak, you know. So that's kind of one issue. And again, the power is not bad at all. It's just that it's just so dependent on coin flips. Like, it's conditional. So again, Marowak EX, decent bulk, but again, Primeape pretty glassy. And then, you know, when you talk about consistency, you just can't, like, going 7-8 rounds with this deck is tough. You know, if you're just playing on the ladder, you know, again, you might take out red card on the ladder. You might, you know, find room for something else that can help the deck be a little bit more consistent. But overall, you know, a 3 out of 5, you know, not terrible. But obviously, you know, some people would say, hey, man, I wish it was, a better deck. But again, that's about the same as we got, I think, the Blaine Ninetales deck from last week. So, all right, going to Arcanine EX and Moltres, which again, I already made a video on this. If you want to check out that video, you can. But again, this is my evaluation on Arcanine EX and Moltres. You can see the deck list, and this is the same deck list that I believe I talked about in my video. So again, it's extremely reliant on Moltres. That's just the way it is. Rarely are you going to attack for damage in your first few turns. You're just trying to ramp, right? You're just trying to ramp and find that Arcanine if you haven't found it. But again, it can absorb damage while scaling up the attacks and evolving on the bench. So like that's good because like Moltres is pretty thick. But again, you might run into some issues where they knock out that Moltres and now you're just like, please, can I find Arcanine? Yeah, that's going to be one of the biggest things is finding Arcanine, right? But again, it's pretty bulky. It will recoil all game as well when you start attacking with Arcanine. So, basically it's give and take. But that breakpoint for Arcanine can be an issue as well because it does fall short of knocking out Mewtwo EX unless you found a way to chip damage on it before. So keep that in mind. I believe Arcanine plus Giovanni can knock out a Zapdos EX, so that's somewhat relevant. But again, in the Pikachu matchup, you should be winning. Yeah, this deck is going to be favored into Pikachu. It's going to struggle against Mewtwo for sure. And hey, who knows? I mean, we'll see how the decks continue to change. But this is definitely a Pikachu Slayer. But again, it's just going to struggle with Pokemon that are outside of Arcanine's that 120, 130 range, right? That's going to be the biggest issue. But 3.4 out of 5. Really cool to see a deck like Arcanine find its groove. I always thought that playing Rapidash was probably the way to go, but I was wrong. I was wrong. Okay, so this is another fan favorite, right? Like people love Dragonite. So I just took a Dragonite Weezing deck with fossils, and like this is another deck where fossils do kind of make sense, right? You want to stall, you want to have the ability to protect your Dragonite, your Dragonair, or your Dratini before you send it out, and fossils allow you to do that. Obviously the Koga and Weezing engine, one of my favorite engines of all time in this game so far. Really cool 6-card engine, and you're not playing Dark Energy. I should make sure I reiterate that you're not playing Dark Energy. It's just the water and electric. But again, stall is the name of the game while you're finding your combo pieces, which is basically one Pokemon. Koga gives you that flexibility, but you're going to need to absorb damage until you can sweep with that 200 damage per turn, right? Hopefully Dragonite doesn't get chipped so it can just come in and just sweep in 2 turns, worst case, and just win you the game. But again, the energy system is one of the big weaknesses. And obviously, dude, like you're playing again another pseudo stage 2 Pokemon, right? You're playing Koga, but you need the Weezing, but you need the Koga, right? And then obviously you need the Coughing. So it's a little bit rough. Sometimes Koga decks can be a little inconsistent because you have to find a 3-card combo almost. But again, hey, 13.5 at 13.5 and 2.7, so not terrible. So this is another deck that was in the comments a lot, Pidgeot and Arbok. Again, this is not going to deal big numbers, but it'll attack pretty much throughout the entire game, right? Like starting with its turn 1, it's probably going to attack you like every turn, right? But the thing is, in the mid to late game, it can just trap Pokemon. The problem is the damage is going to be capped, right? Damage is going to be capped 60 to 70 probably, unless you get lucky with poison, you're able to poison them somehow, and then, get it back up with your no Kogas, right? So, pretty much once that Weezing comes down, and it takes damage, like that's it. You're never going to be able to Koga it up, but you may be able to trap a Pokemon or deal 10 to a Pokemon that then opens up the door for your Arbok to come in and just trap them, right? So the key is get an early knockout against Pikachu decks and then trap one of their EXs where you can beat it in a race. That's the goal. This deck can match up really well into Pikachu and against Mewtwo. Base Mewtwo can give it a little bit of an issue if base Mewtwo finds a way to be early in the game, and then Mewtwo comes in, and then another Mewtwo comes in. Like that's where the deck can struggle, right? But That's a tough scenario for both decks, honestly. But the multiple evolution lines definitely provide a lot of potential for bricks. You know, that's the biggest weakness with decks like this. And again, it's going to be lacking in bulk. Pidgeot does survive Pikachu EX, which is very impressive, but Raichu is just going to cook Pidgeot. So Raichu cooks the entire deck, right? Mewtwo cooks the entire deck. So again, that 140, that 150 range, that's something that you want to pay attention to in terms of bulk. So 2.7 out of 5, you know, 13.5 points, you know, not terrible. Okay, Muck, Weezing, and Arbok. This is another deck. Again, I'm just running down decks that you guys tell me in the comments. So if you want to see more decks, you want to see different decks, drop them in the comments. I want to know. I want to know what you want to see. Because I hope you like these power rankings. I try to go in detail and give you, you know, some different ideas of why I am, you know, evaluating them this way. I think it's a cooler tier list personally. So let's talk about this deck. So it's going to need to evolve on curve to put pressure. Like otherwise the basics are doing very little damage or just like hoping to poison and then eventually evolve to the right Pokemon. Again, the cool thing about this is it can soak damage. Like Arbok and Weezing can both soak damage because Koga is just going to pick it back up. So that's really cool. And then there's synergy with like poisoning and then bringing in a Muck. So that's cool too. And then there's synergy with like poisoning the Pokemon and then trapping it with Arbok. But again, there's a lot of cool synergies, but it's just so much to put together. You know, like that's 3 evolution lines. And you need that Koga, you know, so like it's a lot to ask for. And there's not a lot of switching that you're going to be able to do once these Pokemon evolve, right? You're just going to need Koga or you got to let it ride. So a lot going on in one deck, but I gave it a 2.8 out of 5, 14 total points, so higher than the other decks featuring featuring the Weezing engine, right? All right, we're getting down to the last couple of decks. This is the penultimate deck, so this is the Alakazam and Weezing deck. So again, you'll notice that there is a Meowth down there at the bottom right that you may think is a trainer card until you look at it closer. But yeah, man, Alakazam, it can have difficulty like dealing damage in the early game because, you know, I'm just going to also tell you, by the way, you're playing Dark Energy in this deck. You're playing 2 energy types. So that's one thing to kind of think about too when you're like playing these decks. Like this is the first deck that you're playing like 2 energy types with your Weezing. The other deck that you were playing 2 energy types, it was like Weezing wasn't attacking, so you were playing the Dragonite energies, right? So keep that in mind. But again, you do want that ability to attack with Weezing. I think that's the way to go. Sure, you could play it without the dark energies, but the main reason why you can play 2 energy types is because Alakazam, it only needs 1 psychic. So you know, that can be very, very workable, right? You can definitely do that. Koga can help you pivot as well. That's one thing that I've kind of like kept alluding to in some of these ratings too. That's why a lot of these a lot of these Weezing decks are like 3s out of 5s. But you can pivot and like soak damage on Weezing, and that's a big deal. And then you can bring in Alakazam to do these big numbers, right? I mean, Alakazam can potentially hit 90 to 180, right? It like Alakazam, destroys cards like Nidoking and Nidoqueen, even though they have the type advantage. So, but again, that's got pretty decent bulk, especially with the combos with Koga. But the thing is, again, you can have a lot of bricks and decks that you play Koga with, and then you're on top of that, you're playing a stage 2 deck. So it's a pretty high ceiling one prize attacker. It can be very inconsistent. That's kind of the big issue, right? But 2.8 out of 5, not bad at all. I put it at about the same level as I put the Muck, Arbok, and Weezing deck, right? All right, the last deck before we talk about the total rankings. So I tried to make this quick, by the way, so I'm running through this. I can't see the time yet, but hopefully it's not too long. But this is the Blaine and Ninetales deck. I didn't really, update too much in what I said on the deck, but again, this deck is going to be one of those decks where you want to rely on seeing Ponyta first if you're going first, right, and Vulpix second if you're going second, right? So keep that in mind, right? But again, Farfetch is in there to help finish things off. Maybe you didn't have a Blaine when you needed it, or maybe it's just there for early game pressure, can start chopping down some big threats. But again, decent mid game to late game just because of Ninetales. But again, the bulk is just not there. Like, that's going to be one of the biggest issues with this, right? It's still a 90 to 120, which is on the higher range of the spectrum of power that you see in this video. But again, the health is just it's just so glassy. I mean, it's a glass cannon one prize deck. That's the best way to kind of describe it. But again, it's relying on a couple of evolutions. And then again, you need that pseudo stage 2 and Blaine to really finish things off sometimes. So it's powerful when drawing in good sequence. And again, it has the ability to compete with top EX decks. But let's talk about these rankings. Okay, so these are the overall rankings that I had, and you can kind of check them out. But again, you know, just kind of ranking from top to bottom, you can kind of sort through the different powers too. We'll talk about that really quickly, but you can see that, you know, just because a Pikachu deck has a higher overall rating doesn't mean that it can't, you know, just get beat by some Mewtwo decks, right? It doesn't mean that just because Mewtwo has a higher rating than Charizard that, like, hey, that Charizard can't beat Mewtwo. So keep that in mind. You know, these are just like numbers at the end of the day, and matchups and type weaknesses and matchups are a thing. So keep that in mind when you're taking a look at this list. I think that you know, hey, I think that this is a pretty interesting way of looking at things. And if you have other suggestions on like different criteria that, you know, I should look at, you know, definitely let me know in the comments. But again, you can kind of see how I was looking at these things, and, you know, the different ratings. I'll kind of go through each of them really quick. So this is early game, so that way you can kind of pause if you want, kind of compare mid to late game. And again, like, I just wanted to make sure that when I was done rating these, that I went back and everything kind of made sense, right? Like, I could at least say, hey, here's the narrative for why I put this card or this deck ahead of this deck in this category. And again, power, you can see a lot of that. A lot of the higher, you know, 100 and above attacks are towards the top. A lot of the 90s are towards the middle, right? And the ones that are under that are, you know, below that, right? So pretty simple. Then again, things like health, I didn't type out the health. I pretty much had an idea where I was going there. That didn't really change too much. Yeah, and then, you know, overall consistency here. So yeah, again, I hope that y'all enjoy the power rankings. I stayed up way too late making this, but I wanted to get this out before the weekend, you know, gets here. And again, definitely check out the Pokemon Pocket Legends tournament, all the different tournaments that we got going on this weekend. Definitely check them out on Limitless. And yeah, I will catch y'all next time. Check out some videos that are popping up on the screen right about now.